The tin of laudanum hit the floor of Hollings General Store at 11:15 in the morning. It did not break. It rolled. It rolled across the planks of the floor in a slow, lazy arc and came to rest against the toe of Mrs. Camilla Pelletier's polished black boot. Mrs. Pelletier did not move her boot. She looked down at the tin. She looked up at the woman who had been holding it. The woman who had been holding it was Elsie Whitman, the widowed healer of Stillwater Crossing, who, in 2 years of practice in this town, had set a broken femur for the sheriff's brother, caught the breech twins of the schoolmistress, and saved the life of Mrs. Pelletier's own sister-in-law from a postpartum bleed that the doctor in Casper had said was hopeless before he turned the wagon around at the river crossing. Elsie Whitman was 37 years old. She wore a deep blue prairie dress with the cuffs turned back to the elbow for working, a brown leather strap of her medicine bag across one shoulder, and the kind of low, practical knot at the back of her neck that a woman gets used to wearing when she does not have a great deal of vanity left in her week. She stood 5 feet 5 inches tall. Her face was round and kind and tired. Miss Pelletier's 34. She wore a size 10. She wore a hat from a milliner in Denver. She had 3 children, 2 living. She had not forgotten which sister-in-law it was, and she had not forgotten who had saved her. She did not move her boot. "You'll be wanting that back, Widow Whitman," Mrs. Pelletier said. Her voice was the high, pleasant voice she used at the Ladies' Aid Society on Tuesdays. "It does seem awfully like you cannot keep hold of what's set in front of you. Tins, tonics, husbands." There was a small silence in the store. Then, from behind the flour barrel at the south wall, a child's giggle. Then, from the dry goods counter where 2 of Mrs. Pelletier's friends were standing in matched dark coats, a soft, amused breath. Elsie did not move. She did not bend to pick up the tin. She did not raise her eyes to Mrs. Pelletier's face. She looked instead at the edge of the counter where the small hand of old Mr. Hollings, the proprietor, had stopped halfway across a sheet of brown paper he had been about to fold around her order. His hand did not move either. Elsie said in a low, even voice, "I will take it back when you have lifted your boot, Mrs. Pelletier. I am sure you will. The trouble is, dear, that I do not believe a woman of your build can bend that far without difficulty. I would not wish you to embarrass yourself." The 2 women at the counter laughed. The child behind the flour barrel laughed. Mr. Hollings did not laugh. His hand was still on the brown paper. Elsie set her hands flat on the counter. She did not move. She did not bend. She did not answer. She had learned in the 4 years since her husband had been killed in the silver mine collapse at Rock Creek that the only thing you could do with a woman like Camilla Pelletier was outweight her. Camilla Pelletier did not have the temperament for silence. Camilla Pelletier needed to fill silences. Camilla Pelletier would, if you stood very still and said nothing, eventually move her boot. The silence held for 10 seconds, then 20. Then 30. Camilla Pelletier did not move her boot. Behind the flour barrel, the child's giggle had stopped. The 2 women at the counter were no longer breathing the small, amused breath. Mr. Hollings' hand on the brown paper had begun slowly to slide. Elsie kept her hands flat on the counter. She kept her eyes on the brown paper. She thought very calmly about a thing her mother had told her when she was 9 years old in the kitchen of their farmhouse in Lancaster County. Her mother had said, "There are women in this world, child, who will try to teach you to be smaller. The lesson will never take. You will keep being the size you were born to be. The only thing in your power is whether you will let them feel they have taught you." Elsie did not let them feel they had taught her. But she did not, on her own strength, raise her eyes to look Camilla Pelletier in the face either. The cost of that look was a cost she did not have enough in her purse to pay this morning. She had been up since 2 in the night with the Henderson baby on the North Road. She had walked 4 miles back into town through fresh snow. She had not yet had her breakfast. The strength for the look would not come from inside her. This morning it came from the door. The bell over the door of Hollings General Store gave its small flat ring. The cold air came in around someone's boots. Elsie did not turn her head. She did not need to. She knew the shape of the silence that came in behind that bell. The shape of the silence had been a known shape in Stillwater Crossing for 7 years. Camilla Pelletier looked toward the door. Her mouth, which had been arranged in a small, pleasant curve, did not close. It did not open further. It simply held, fixed where it had been, while the rest of her face caught up to what her eyes were seeing. Mr. Hollings' hand finished sliding off the brown paper. It fell, soft, against the wood of the counter. The two women at the counter took one small step apart from each other, the way people do without knowing they have done it, when a draft comes in from the wrong direction. Elsie raised her eyes at last off the brown paper. She did not turn her head. She did not need to. In the small flat reflection of the window glass behind the counter, in the polished surface where Mr. Hollings kept the bottles of horse liniment lined up in a row, she saw the shape of a man standing inside the door of the store, snow on the shoulders of his fur-lined coat, a wide-brimmed hat held in one large hand, a dark beard, a long, quiet face, eyes she had seen perhaps 4 times in 2 years, and never up close, looking now across the store at the boot that was on the tin of laudanum on the floor. The man was Wade Buchanan. He was the mountain man who lived on the high ridge 5 miles north of Stillwater Crossing. He had not been inside this store, by Elsie's count, in 19 months. He took 2 steps forward. He stopped. He did not speak. He looked at Camilla Pelletier's boot, then at Camilla Pelletier's face, then at the tin under the boot. He did not say a word. He waited. Camilla Pelletier lifted her boot. The tin of laudanum rolled in the same slow, lazy arc it had taken before, back across the floor toward Elsie Whitman's hem. Wade Buchanan stepped forward. He stooped. He picked the tin up off the floor. He stood. He set it gently on the counter beside Elsie's hand. He had not looked at Elsie yet. He looked at Mr. Hollings. He said, in a low, quiet voice that carried, somehow, to the back of the store without being loud, "Mom will have what she came in for. Add it to my account." Mr. Hollings nodded once. His hand picked up the brown paper. His other hand reached, without looking, for the small wooden box where he kept the ledger. Wade Buchanan turned then to Elsie. He looked at her for the first time. His eyes were the gray of cold river water. He said, "Widow Whitman." She said, "Mr. Buchanan." He said, "If you will allow me, I will carry your bag for you back to your cabin. The snow is coming heavy off the North Pass." She did not answer right away. She looked at him. She looked at the medicine bag on her shoulder, which she had been carrying alone for 4 years. She looked back at his face. She said, "Mr. Buchanan, I would be obliged." He nodded once. He did not smile. He did not soften his face. He did not, in any way that would have given a Stillwater wife a thing to say later in her kitchen, behave with anything other than the formal courtesy of a man who had been raised by a Presbyterian mother in Tennessee and had never forgotten it. Camilla Pelletier was by this point recovering. Her mouth had moved through its small fixed hold and was now arranging itself into a tight, bright shape that meant she had thought of something to say. She said, "Mr. Buchanan, what a surprise it is to see you in town. We so rarely have the pleasure." He turned his head toward her. He did not turn his body. He did not lift his hat off the back of the hand that held it. He looked at her with the look of a man looking at a stone in the road that he had not yet decided whether to step over or kick. He said, "Mrs. Pelletier." He did not say anything else. She waited for him to. He did not. Her smile, which had been bright, faded by 1 degree. She looked at her 2 friends at the counter. They looked at the floor. She looked back at Wade Buchanan. His eyes had not left her face. She said weakly, "Well, the snow does seem to be getting heavy. We had best be on our way." She turned. She gathered her friends with a small flick of her gloved hand. the way a woman who is used to being followed gathers women. The three of them moved in a tight, dark cluster toward the door. The bell over the door rang twice as they went out. The cold came in. The door closed. The store was very quiet for a long moment. Mr. Hollings cleared his throat. He finished folding the brown paper around Elsie's order. He tied the string. He pushed the package across the counter to her. He said, in a small voice, "On the house, Mom."
She said, "Mr. Hollings, I will pay for my order."
He looked at her. He nodded. He took the coins she counted out onto the wood. He did not say anything else. The child behind the flour barrel had come out. The child was a small girl in a green wool coat. She was looking at Wade Buchanan with both her small eyes round. She did not look frightened. She looked the way a child looks when she has seen something she will tell her mother about and will be told not to talk about. Wade Buchanan looked at the small girl. He said, "Lo, child." She did not answer. She backed slow behind the flour barrel again. He picked up the brown paper package. He picked up the leather strap of Elsie's medicine bag, where it lay on the counter. He lifted them both. He did not say anything about it. He waited for Elsie to come around the end of the counter and join him at the door. She came. At the door, before they stepped through, he held it open with one large hand. He let her pass him first. He stepped out behind her into the cold, bright morning, and the bell over the door of Hollings General Store gave one last, small, flat ring. And the door closed behind them, and they stood for a moment, the two of them, on the wooden walk in front of the store, with the snow falling soft and even over the main street of Stillwater Crossing. Wade Buchanan said quiet, "Which way to your cabin, Mum?" Elsie said, "East, past the church, past the schoolhouse, past the smithy. The third cabin on the right after the bend in the road." He nodded once. He shifted her bag higher on his shoulder. The bag had been on her own shoulder for 4 years. The strap had worn a dark line into the wool of her own coat. She watched him shift the bag, and she felt, with a small surprise she did not let onto her face, that the strap on her own shoulder, where it had lain a moment before, was light. He set off east down the wooden walk. She walked beside him. They did not speak. The snow came down. The bell over the door of Hollings did not ring again. Behind the window of the store, Mr. Hollings stood for a long moment looking out. He saw the two of them go past the church. He saw them go past the schoolhouse. He saw them go past the smithy. He saw them turn at the bend in the road. He turned away from the window. He went slow to the back of the store. He sat down on his small stool by the stove. He took off his spectacles. He rubbed the bridge of his nose with the heel of his hand. He said to no one in particular, "About time." The walk from the front of Hollings General Store to the third cabin past the bend in the east road was, by the standard measure of Stillwater Crossing, 950 yards. It took Elsie Whitman and Wade Buchanan 22 minutes. They walked slowly. They did not speak at first. The snow fell in fat, slow flakes that landed and stayed on the wool of their coats. The wooden walk gave way, past the smithy to packed snow and then to fresh. Wade Buchanan walked on Elsie's left side between her and the street. He did not offer her his arm. He did not need to. The walk had been swept by the small boys of the smithy at sunrise, and the new snow had not yet gone deep enough to ask for an arm. At the corner of the smithy, where the road bent east toward the cabins, Elsie said, "Lo, Mr. Buchanan." He said, "Mom, I would not have asked. I know. I was managing. I know." She walked a few steps in silence. Then she said, "Why?" He did not answer for a moment. Then he said, "Why what, Mom? Why today? Why you? Why now?" He took a long, slow breath through his nose. He said, "I was at the smithy this morning. I came down to bring Mr. Jakes a pair of axe heads to be reset. When I came past the front of the store, the door was open a crack from the last person going in. I heard a woman's voice say a thing about a husband. I heard a child laugh. I heard a silence. I do not pretend to know the customs of this town very well, Mom, but I knew the silence." She looked at Heimweis. She said, "Knew it how?" He looked ahead at the snow. He said, I knew it from my mother's kitchen in 1861. I knew it from a small store in Lawrence, Kansas in 1863. I knew it from a wagon stop outside Pueblo in 1874. I have heard that silence before, Mom. It is the silence a kitchen or a store or a wagon stop makes when one woman has decided to teach another woman to be smaller in front of an audience. I do not know what your sin was supposed to be. I do not need to know. I have only ever cared for one thing about that silence. She said, "What thing?" He said, "Whether anyone was going to break it." I have learned over 41 years, Mom, that 9 times out of 10 no one is going to. I learned that the 10th time you can be the one, if you can. I happened to be in a place this morning where I could, so I was. She did not answer for a long moment. They passed the church. The snow on the steps of the church had not been swept. There were no footprints. The Reverend was this morning, evidently elsewhere. She said, "Mr. Buchanan." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "You did not lecture me on how I should not let her bother me." "No, ma'am, you did not tell me she was a small person of no consequence." "No, ma'am, you did not tell me that her words said more about her than about me." "No, ma'am." "Why not?" He thought about it. He said after a moment, "Because all 3 of those things would have made you the person who needed to be corrected." You were not the person who needed to be corrected. She was. So I corrected her. The rest is your business, Mom, not mine. She walked 4 more steps. She did not say anything. Then she said very quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Buchanan." He said, "Wade." She said, "Wade." He said, "Mom." She said, "Elsie." He nodded once. He did not say her name yet. She had the sense, walking beside him, that he was a man who would not say a woman's first name until the 3rd or 4th time she had told him to. She had the sense also that the 3rd or 4th time would, when it came, mean a thing. They walked past the schoolhouse. The small windows of the schoolhouse were lit. Inside, the school mistress was reading to 20 children from a primer. Elsie heard the small voices read back in the unison of small children reading. She did not stop. She kept walking. At the bend in the road, they passed Mrs. Holloway's cabin. Mrs. Holloway was in her yard breaking a strip of frozen wash off the line. She looked up. She saw them. Her face did not change. She nodded once to Elsie. She nodded once to Wade. She went back to her wash. Elsie said low, "Mrs. Holloway will tell 3 women by sundown. She will. They will tell 6 more by morning. They will. By Sunday, Camilla Pelletier will hear the story of how the mountain man walked the widow home from the store, told in a way that will not flatter either of us. By Sunday, Mrs. Pelletier will not be the only one with a story to remember." She looked at him. She did not know yet what he meant by that. She would know before the week was out. But she let it lie for now. They walked the last 50 yards in silence. They came to the 3rd cabin past the bend on the right. She stopped. She set her hand on the latch of her own gate. She said, "Will you come in for coffee, Mr. Buchanan?" He said, "I will not, Mom. I have a boy at home who will be looking for me by noon. I will set your bag on the porch. I will say good morning. I will say I am sorry for the way today started." She looked at him. She said, "Wade, the day did not start until you walked in." The thing before that was not a day. He looked at her. The gray of his eyes softened by 1 degree that she would later, in the years to come, think of as the first softening she had ever seen in his face. He set the medicine bag on the porch. He set the brown paper package on top of it. He took 1 step back. He took his hat off, slow, the way men of his generation took off hats when they were about to say a thing that mattered to them. He said, "Elsie." She said, "Wade." He said, "If a thing like that happens again, in that store or any store in this town, you send a child to my cabin, I will come." She said, "Wade, a thing like that has happened to me in this town on average once a month for 4 years. I cannot send a child to your cabin 1,000 times." He said, "Send a child to my cabin once. Once will be enough. There will not be a second time." She did not know yet what he meant by that either. She would know that too, before Sunday. She nodded. He put his hat back on. He turned. He walked off down the snow back toward the bend in the road. He did not look back. She stood on her porch for a long time with the medicine bag at her feet, and the snow falling on the brim of her own bonnet, and the small, honest weight of having been carried for one short morning by a man who had not asked her to lift the weight for him. After a long while, she picked up the bag. She picked up the brown paper package. She went inside and put the kettle on. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried often. But she sat for a long minute on the wooden chair beside her own stove, with the kettle ticking up to a boil and the snow falling outside the window. And she let herself feel the strange, unaccustomed lightness of her left shoulder where the leather strap had not been for 950 yards. She had been a healer in this town for 4 years. She had carried that bag by her own count more than 2,000 miles. No one in Stillwater Crossing had ever offered to carry it for her. One person had now. She drank her coffee slow. Elsie Whitman had not come to Stillwater Crossing by choice. She had come by widowhood. She had been raised in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, in a stone farmhouse her grandfather had built in 1814 with the help of 2 of his own brothers and a Mennonite neighbor whose name had been written in pencil on the underside of the kitchen sill, where Elsie's mother had shown it to her when she was 8. She had been the 3rd of 5 children. Her mother had been a midwife. Her father had farmed 60 acres of corn and kept 3 milk cows and had played the fiddle on Saturday evenings on the front porch until the day in 1864 when a letter came from the army saying his oldest son had died at Spotsylvania. Her father had not played the fiddle again. He had farmed the 60 acres for 9 more years and had died of pneumonia in the spring of 1873. Elsie had been 27. She had been the only child still at home. She had buried him. She had stood at the kitchen door of the stone farmhouse the morning after the burial. She had looked out at the 60 acres. She had decided that morning that she would go west. She had gone west with her mother's medicine satchel, her mother's herb book, and the small carved oak box that had held her grandfather's wedding band. The grandfather had given it to her with his own hand the year before he died. He had said, in his slow Pennsylvania English, "Take it west, girl. Wear it when you find a man worth wearing it for." She had worn it for the first time in 1875 in a small clapboard chapel in Rock Creek, Wyoming, beside a man named Daniel Whitman, who was a silver miner from Cornwall, and who had courted her over the course of 7 months with 3 slow, honest letters and 1 careful trip down from the mine on his Sunday off. They had married in October. He had been killed in February. The mine had collapsed in a snow-heavy storm, and they had not gotten his body out for 3 days. She had buried him in the small cemetery on the south slope of Rock Creek. She had stood at the grave with the wedding band on her finger, and she had not taken it off since. She had been 33. She had been a widow for 1.5 years before she could bring herself to look in a mirror again. And when she had not looked any different to herself than she had looked the day before the mine collapsed. The widowhood had been inside her, not on her. She had moved to Stillwater Crossing in 1878 because the town of Rock Creek had begun to fail, and the town of Stillwater had begun to grow, and the women of Stillwater had needed a midwife. She had set up her cabin on the East Road. She had hung her shingle. She had built her practice. She had buried 4 patients in 4 years and had caught 31 babies and had not lost a mother. She had not been to a Sunday service since the funeral in Rock Creek. She had not allowed herself on any of the long nights of her widowhood to think of any second marriage or any second wedding band or any second man. She had grown in those 4 years from a size 16 to a size 18. She had not minded. The work of the practice was a work that did not care for a woman's waist. The mothers who called her in the night did not care for a woman's waist. The babies did not care. The women of the Ladies' Aid Society cared. Camilla Pelletier cared. The Reverend Augustus Crane, who had taken the pulpit of the Stillwater Church in 1880, cared. He had not said anything to her face. He had said 3 times in 2 years things about her from the pulpit. He had used the word indulgence twice. He had used the word vanity once. He had used the word, in one sermon by which he had meant her body without naming her body, twice. She had not gone back to the church after the second sermon. She had not needed to. The mothers who called her did not need her to. That was the woman who walked that snow-heavy morning beside the mountain man named Wade Buchanan, from the front of Hollings General Store to the 3rd cabin, past the bend in the East Road. That was the woman who poured the kettle in her own kitchen. That was the woman who would, before the next Sunday, become the woman this town would either learn to honor or learn to lose. She did not know it yet. She was, that morning, only the woman drinking coffee at her own table, looking at the snow on the window, listening to the small, kind silence of a kitchen where her own bag was on the floor by the door instead of on her shoulder for the first time in 4 years. She thought, slow about her grandfather's words. She did not that morning think any further than that. But she did that morning reach without looking for the small carved oak box on the high shelf above the stove. She brought the box down. She set it on the table. She opened it. The grandfather's ring was inside, beside her own wedding band, where she had laid it after Rock Creek. She looked at the 2 rings for a long time. She did not take the wedding band off. She did not put the grandfather's ring on. She closed the box. She put the box back on the shelf. She finished her coffee. She washed the cup. She went out the back door of her cabin to the small lean, to where she kept her dried herbs hanging from the rafters in the dark. She began, with hands that had stopped being light at her sides, to sort the next week's poultices. By noon the snow had stopped. The sun had come out. The road had begun to glisten. By 3 o'clock, the news of the morning at Hollings had made its way to 17 households in Stillwater Crossing. By sundown, it had made its way to 24. By the time the lamps were lit, every wife in town knew that the mountain man named Wade Buchanan had walked the widow Whitman home from the general store with her medicine bag on his shoulder, and that Camilla Pelletier had lifted her boot. Some of the wives sitting at their kitchen tables smiled. Most did not. Wade Buchanan, that same evening, sat on the bench in front of his own cabin on the high ridge 5 miles north of Stillwater Crossing, and he watched his son chop kindling against a stump in the slow blue light. His son was Asa Buchanan. Asa was 8 years old. He was tall for his age. He had his father's brown hair and his mother's small, straight nose. He held the small axe carefully, the way Wade had taught him to, with both hands and the wood braced. He did not chop fast. He chopped well. Wade watched. He did not speak. He had not spoken often to anyone except Asa for 7 years. Wade Buchanan had been born in 1841 in a holler outside Knoxville, Tennessee. He had been the second son of a Presbyterian school teacher and a midwife. His mother had died of childbed fever when he was 9. His father had raised him and his older brother alone on a teacher's salary in a 4-room cabin with a Bible on the table and a fiddle on the wall. The fiddle, like Elsie Whitman's father's fiddle, had stopped being played in the year his older brother had enlisted in the Confederate Army against his father's wishes at the age of 17. The brother had been killed at Shiloh. Wade had been 15. Wade had not enlisted on either side. His father had said once, "Son, I have lost one son to a war that should not have been fought. I will not give the other." Wade had stayed. He had finished his schooling. He had taken over the small farm his father kept beside the schoolhouse. He had married at the age of 22 a woman named Margaret Holloway from the next holler over, who had been a friend of his mother's daughter at the church. Margaret had borne him Asa in 1872. She had borne him a second son, who had been stillborn, in 1874. She had died of the consequence of that second birth 3 weeks later. Wade had been 33. He had stood at her grave in the same churchyard where his mother and his brother and his father were buried. He had taken the small, stillborn son's body in a wooden box and buried him beside her. He had not gone back to that churchyard since. He had taken Asa, who had been 2, and his rifle, and his father's Bible, and the small carved walnut box that had held his wedding ring and his mother's wedding ring and his brother's letters home from the war, and he had gone west. He had gone west because the holler outside Knoxville had stopped being a place he could live in. The same trees, the same road, the same kitchen, the same bed. He had not been able to walk past the small wooden cross of the second son's grave one more time without breaking. He had not been a man who broke. He had moved instead until he had found a place where there was no second wooden cross to walk past. He had built the cabin on the high ridge above Stillwater Crossing in the autumn of 1875. He had raised Asa alone for 7 years. He had come down into town, on his own count, 11 times. Twice for flour, 3 times for axes, once for nails, once for a saddle blanket, twice for the doctor who would not come up the ridge, once for the funeral of Tom Wilkinson, the blacksmith, who had been kind to him in his first month, and once this morning for a pair of axe heads. He had not been a man who needed company. He had been a man who needed quiet. The high ridge had given him quiet. The boy had given him purpose. He had thought, more than once over the 7 years, that this was the shape of the rest of his life. He had been at peace with that thought. He was no longer at peace with that thought. He had become at peace with it that morning at 24 minutes past 11, when he had stepped into the door of Hollings General Store and had heard a silence he had heard before, and had walked into the silence and had seen the woman at the counter who had refused to bend to pick up a tin of laudanum off the floor. He had known her by sight for 2 years. He had known her by her work for longer. She had ridden out to his cabin once in the autumn of 1879 with a poultice for Asa when Asa had run a fever Wade could not break. She had not been called. Wade had been about to ride down himself for the doctor when she had come up the ridge on her own horse, alone, in a blue dress and a brown coat, because Mr. Hollings had heard at the store from a freighter that the boy on the high ridge was sick. She had spent the night at the cabin. She had brought the boy's fever down by morning. She had ridden back down the ridge at noon with no payment because she had said she had not been asked to come. He had not forgotten that. He had thought, in the 7 years on the ridge, of one woman in Stillwater Crossing only. He had thought of her without permission. He had thought of her against his own will. He had thought of her on the morning he had carried Asa down to the river to teach him to fish in 1880. He had thought of her on the night in February of 1881 when a wolf had come into the yard and he had stood at the door with the rifle in the cold for an hour. He had thought of her at his own table on the nights he ate alone with the boy across from him. He had not thought he would do anything about it. He had thought he would let it be the small private thing of a man who had been alone too long. He had been at peace with that thought too. The silence at Hollings had unmade that peace. He sat on the bench. The boy chopped. The light went blue. The first star came out over the ridge. Asa set the axe down. He picked up the kindling. He brought it to the bench. He set it beside his father. The boy said, "Pa." Wade said, "Yes, son, you went to town today." "I did." "You don't go to town." "I went." Asa thought about this. He was a boy who thought before he spoke. He said, after a moment, "Did you see Mrs. Whitman?" Wade looked at his son. The boy did not look at him. The boy looked at the kindling on the bench. The boy said, "Very small. She gave me a sugar candy that night. I never said thank you." Wade put his hand on the back of his son's neck. He held it there for a long moment. He said, "We will say thank you, son, soon." The boy nodded. The boy carried the kindling inside. Wade sat on the bench in the blue light. He looked east, down the ridge, toward the small far lights of Stillwater Crossing. He sat for a long time. Then he stood. He went inside. He lit the lamp. He took down the small carved walnut box from the high shelf over the table. He opened it. The 2 wedding rings were inside, his and Margaret's, where he had laid them 7 years ago in the kitchen of a holler outside Knoxville. He looked at the rings. He did not take Margaret's out. He did not put his own on. He closed the box. He put it back on the shelf. He sat down at his own table with his son across from him. He did not say anything during the meal. The boy did not either. The boy was used to silence at meals. But that night, when the lamp was low and the boy was asleep in the small bed in the corner, Wade Buchanan sat by the stove for a long time with his hands open on his knees. He thought, slow, about a woman who had walked 1,000 miles with her own bag and had not asked anyone to carry it. He thought, slow, about the simple fact that he had not asked her permission to carry it for her this morning. He thought, slow, about whether the next time he saw her he would ask. He thought, slow, about whether he should. The fire in the stove went down. The wind on the ridge picked up. Snow came in soft against the window. He did not sleep until 2 in the morning. By Sunday, 4 days later, he had not slept past 4 o'clock any night. By Sunday, he was a man who had decided a thing. The storm came in on the Thursday, 3 days after the morning at Hollings. It came in faster than the freighters had said it would. It came in off the North Pass before the sun had fully set on Wednesday. By midnight Wednesday, it had laid 8 inches of fresh snow on the roof of every cabin in Stillwater Crossing. By dawn on Thursday, it had laid 16. By noon on Thursday, the road north out of town toward the lumber camp at Whitlow Creek was gone. The lumber camp at Whitlow Creek was the place that, by sundown on Thursday, 3 small boys had walked out of and into the white. The 3 boys were Elsie Buchanan, who had been visiting his uncle, the foreman, for the week before the storm, and Tom and Henry Pelletier, the 2 living sons of Mr. and Mrs. Camilla Pelletier, who had been visiting the same uncle on the same trip. The boys, by the account of the foreman, had wandered out to track an elk at 3 in the afternoon. The foreman had thought they had gone toward the mess hut. The mess hut had thought they had gone with the foreman. They had gone, in fact, north toward the ridge, and the storm had come down over them between the 2nd and 3rd hour, and the foreman had not known any of it until the foreman's wife had called for the boys at supper, and the boys had not come. The foreman had ridden into Stillwater Crossing at 7:30 in the evening with his horse half blown. He had ridden to Wade Buchanan's cabin first. Wade had not been there. The cabin door had been unlocked. The fire had been banked. Asa, who had been Wade's reason for sitting at the stove every night for 7 years, had not been there either. The foreman had ridden then into town. He had ridden to the front of the Pelletier house on the main street. He had pounded on the door. Mr. Pelletier had come out. Camilla Pelletier had come out behind him in a wool shawl over her nightdress. The foreman had told them. Camilla Pelletier had not said anything for a long second. Her face by the lantern over the door had drained of all its color in the way that faces drain when they hear a thing they cannot afford to have heard. Then she had said, in a voice nobody in town had heard her use before, "Get me the widow Whitman." Her husband had said, "Camilla." She had said, "Get me the widow Whitman now. Get her and the mountain man if he is in town, whatever it costs." Her husband had looked at her. He had looked at the foreman. He had said, "I will go to the widow Whitman myself." He had gone. He had walked the 400 yards from his front door to Elsie Whitman's front door in his slippers, because he did not stop for boots. He had pounded on her door at 8 in the evening with snow on his bare wrists. Elsie had opened the door in her wool wrapper. She had taken one look at his face. She had said, "Whose child?" He had said, "2 of mine, and the Buchanan boy." She had said, "Get in. Sit by the stove. Tell me where, when, how many." He had told her. She had been pulling her boots on while he told her. She had been throwing the second wool dress over her first. She had been pulling her husband's old wool coat down from the peg. She had been packing the bag. She had not asked him for anything except the foreman's name and the direction. She had said, "I will need 3 horses. I will need a wagon I can break down into a stretcher. I will need 3 lanterns. I will need a man who knows the North Pass." He had said, "I will get you the horses and the lanterns. I will get you the wagon. I will go with you myself." She had looked at him. She had said, "You will not." He had said, "I will." She had said, "Mr. Pelletier, with respect, you have not been on the North Pass in winter. I have not been on the North Pass at all. The only person in this valley who has been on the North Pass in a winter storm is the mountain man who lives at the top of it. The mountain man whose own son is up there with yours. I will not take you. I will take him. You will stay with your wife. Your wife will not be alone tonight." She had paused. She had said in a voice he had never heard from her, "And Mr. Pelletier, when this is done, we will speak. Not tonight, tomorrow, or the day after." He had nodded slow. He had said in a small voice, "Yes, Mom." She had picked up her bag. She had picked up her lantern. She had stepped out into the snow. She had reached Wade Buchanan's cabin on the high ridge at 10:30 that night. She had not gone the road. She had gone the cut through the pines that the freighters used in winter, on a borrowed horse from the Pelletier stables. The horse had been good. The cut had been hard. She had reached the porch. The porch had been empty. The window had been dark. But the small wooden box outside the door, the box where Wade Buchanan kept his split kindling, had been open and half spilled. The horse he kept in his small lean-to was gone. The tracks from the lean-to went in the new snow north up the ridge. He had not been waiting for word. He had not been waiting for a wagon. He had heard by some channel of the high country she could not name that his boy was out, and he had gone after him alone. She did not turn the horse around. She rode after him north up the ridge, in the dark and the storm, with 1 lantern and a medicine bag, and a small canteen of warm broth she had wrapped in her wool. She caught him at the second switchback. He was on foot. His own horse had thrown a shoe in the deep. He was leading it. He saw her coming up the trail with the lantern. He stopped. He did not say a word. He waited. She rode up to him. She slid down off the horse. She handed him the second lantern she had carried under her arm. She handed him the canteen of warm broth. She said, "Take this horse. Mine is fresh. Go ahead. I will follow on yours. I will lead it. I will catch you at the top." He looked at her. He said in the low voice he had used at Hollings, "Elsie." She said, "Wade, go." He went. He swung up onto her horse. He kicked it forward into the snow. The lantern swung from his belt. The dark closed behind him. She took the bridle of his lame horse. She started up the ridge on foot. The wind came across the face of the slope and tried to take the lantern out of her hand. She did not let it. She walked. It took her, by her own count, 1 hour and 40 minutes to reach the top of the ridge. By the time she reached the top, the lantern of Wade Buchanan was at the far edge of the high pasture, in the lee of the rock outcrop, where he had built, years before, a low shelter of pine logs against the snow for his own elk hunts. By the time she reached the shelter, Wade Buchanan had carried out of it 3 small boys. 3 small boys who had crawled into the shelter when the storm had taken the sun. 3 small boys who had pressed themselves into the lee of the pine logs and held each other for warmth for the 6 hours since. 2 of the boys had been crying when she got there. The third, the small Buchanan boy, had not been crying. He had been holding the hands of the 2 crying boys, one in each of his hands, and he had been saying, in the calm, small voice of a child who has been raised by a man who does not speak much, "It will be all right. My pa will come. My pa always comes." Wade Buchanan had been on his knees in the snow when Elsie reached the shelter. He had been holding his boy in his arms. He had not been crying either. He had been breathing. Elsie set the lantern in the snow. She knelt. She set her hands on the cheeks of the 2 Pelletier boys, one at a time, and she counted their pulses, and she felt their fingers, and she looked at the color of their lips. She said, "Frostbite on the second one, mild. The first is colder than I like. The Buchanan boy is the best of the three. Wade said into his son's hair. Of course he is, she said. Wade, we get them down now. The wagon is at the foot of the pass. Mr. Pelletier is bringing the wagon up the cut. We carry the two Pelletiers between us. Your boy will ride on his own. The boy in his father's arms turned his small face up. The boy said, Pa, I held them the whole time. Wade pressed his cheek to the top of the boy's head. He said low, I know, son. I know you did. Elsie did not look at them for a long second. She picked up her medicine bag. She unrolled the wool blanket from inside. She wrapped the two Pelletier boys in it together. She lifted the smaller of the two herself against her chest, because her chest was warmer than the snow, and her arms were strong from carrying 1,000 miles of bag. Wade took the larger Pelletier boy on his own back, with one arm under each of the boy's thighs and the boy's arms around his neck. He took Asa by the hand. The four of them, with the two horses, went down the ridge through the storm to the wagon. They reached the wagon at 2:30 in the morning. The three boys lived. By dawn on Friday, the Pelletier boys were both in their own beds at the front of the Pelletier house on the main street of Stillwater Crossing, with Elsie Whitman bent over the larger one's hands, working warmed olive oil into the white tips of two of his fingers. The frostbite would cost the boy the tip of one finger. That was the count. One fingertip, not 3, not 5, not the boy. Camilla Pelletier sat in the wing chair beside the bed. She had not slept. She had not changed out of the wool shawl over her nightdress. She had not spoken to Elsie except to say, when Elsie had come through the door at 3 in the morning with the boy in her arms, the word, please. Elsie had said nothing. She had set the boy on the bed. She had begun the work. It was at 9:30 in the morning, with the sun beginning to climb the front windows, that Camilla Pelletier spoke a second time. She said in a voice that was not her store voice, Widow Whitman. Elsie did not look up from the boy's hand. She said, Yes, Mrs. Pelletier. I was not going to lift my boot. Elsie said, I know. I was going to let it sit there until you bent. I was going to let the women laugh. I know. I do not know why I was going to do that. Elsie said, mild, I do not need to know, Mrs. Pelletier. The boot is in the past. The boy is in the present. Camilla Pelletier was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, You came up the ridge for him. I did. You went into the storm for him. I did. For both of mine, for all three of them. For the boy on the ridge. For the boy on the ridge. Camilla Pelletier looked down at her hands in her lap. Her hands were shaking. She had not let them shake all night. She said, Widow Whitman, I owe you a thing. I do not have a thing in this house that is worth the thing I owe you. There is not money. There is not silver. There is not a kindness I have ever shown you that begins to amount. Elsie said, Mrs. Pelletier, yes, you owe me one thing only. Name it. Elsie looked up. She looked at Camilla Pelletier across the bed. She said, On Sunday, when the Reverend Crane stands up to preach, if he opens his Bible to a verse about a woman's body, or a woman's vanity, or a woman's place, or a widow's conduct, I want you to stand up in your pew, in the front row of the church, in front of the whole town, and I want you to walk out the front door of that church, and I want you to keep walking, down the steps, down the main street, past the smithy, past the schoolhouse, past the church gate, to the third cabin on the right past the bend in the east road. And I want you to knock on my door. Camilla Pelletier was very still. Elsie said, I will be home. I will open the door. I will not preach you a sermon. I will pour you a cup of coffee. And we will sit, and we will speak, and we will start over. Not as women who have wronged each other. As women who have lived in this same valley for 4 years and have not, until this week, said one true thing to each other. Camilla Pelletier looked down at her hands. Her hands had stopped shaking. She nodded, once slow. She said in a small voice, I will walk out of the church. Elsie nodded. She turned her eyes back to the boy's hand. She kept working the warmed oil into the white tips. The fever in the smaller Pelletier boy came up at 1:30 in the afternoon. It came up fast. It came up because the smaller boy, the 8-year-old, had inhaled the cold of the storm into a chest that had been weak since a bout of croup the year before. By 2 o'clock, he was at 101. By 3, he was at 103. By 4, he was at 104.2, and he was not waking when his mother called to him. Elsie sat up at his bedside with everything she had: willow tea, yarrow, a cool cloth on the forehead, a second cool cloth on the chest, a steam tent of pine and eucalyptus over a small basin. She sent Mr. Pelletier at 4:30 with a folded note to Dr. Eli Pearson on the south end of town. The note said, "I have a boy at 104. I need carbolic. I need quinine. I need a second pair of hands if you can spare them." Mr. Pelletier came back at 5 with the carbolic and the quinine. He came back without the doctor. He said with his eyes on the floor, "He says he cannot leave Mrs. Burke. She is in labor. He says he is sorry." Elsie said, "Tell him I understand. Tell him to send word as soon as Mrs. Burke delivers." She turned back to the boy. She worked. At 6 in the evening, the boy's fever broke briefly. He woke. He said, "Mama." He went back under. At 7, the fever climbed again. At 7:30, Elsie sent a second note. This one not to the doctor. This one to Wade Buchanan. The note said, "Wade, boy at Pelletier House, fever 104, need you. Bring kettle of birch bark from my shelf above the stove. Eastern wall, top jar. Bring whatever sleep is in you. Bring Asa. Asa will sit with the older boy. Asa is the only one in this town that boy will sit still for." She gave the note to Mr. Pelletier's stable boy. The stable boy rode the cut up to the ridge with the fastest of the Pelletier horses. He was at the cabin by 8:30. Wade Buchanan was on the porch when the horse came up. Asa was beside him in his wool coat. They had been waiting for the note. They rode down together. They reached the Pelletier house at 10. Wade walked in the front door with the birch bark and the boy. Camilla Pelletier was in the hallway. She stopped where she stood when she saw him. She said, "Mr. Buchanan." He said, "Mom." He did not stop to speak. He went up the stairs to the boys' room. He set the birch bark on the table. He took off his coat. He sat down on the chair beside the bed across from Elsie. He said, "Elsie." She said, "Wait." He said, "Tell me what you need," she told him. They worked. Asa Buchanan, in the next room, sat in a chair beside the older boy and held his bandaged hand and told him a story, in the small, calm voice he had used in the shelter, about an elk his father had once tracked for 2 days through the snow without firing a shot, because the elk had been a mother. The fever broke at 4 in the morning. By 5, the boy was sleeping, the deep, honest sleep of a child whose body had decided to live. By 6, the sun was coming up over the snow on the main street of Stillwater Crossing. By 6:15, Wade Buchanan was on the bench in the hallway of the Pelletier house with his head against the wall and his eyes closed and his right hand loose on his knee, holding the hand of Elsie Whitman. Camilla Pelletier came to the doorway. She did not say anything. She stood. She looked at the two of them. She turned around. She went back into her younger son's room. She sat by the bed and watched her child breathe. Sunday morning came in clear and cold. The bell of the white-painted Stillwater Crossing church rang at 10. The town came. The Reverend Augustus Crane stood at the pulpit in his Sunday coat. The pews filled. The front pew by tradition held the Pelletier family. The pew was empty at 5 minutes to 10. It filled at 3 minutes to 10 with Mr. Pelletier and Camilla Pelletier and the older Pelletier boy, whose hand was bandaged, and the smaller Pelletier boy, whose fever had broken 30 hours before, and who walked into the church in his Sunday best with his small face, pale and serious, and had his mother's hand on his shoulder. The back pew on the left side, by no tradition at all, held a small new family. Elsie Whitman in her best dark blue prairie dress, Asa Buchanan beside her in his Sunday coat. Wade Buchanan beside Asa in a black coat Elsie had pressed for him on the morning before. They sat. They did not speak. The town saw them. The town did not look away. The Reverend Crane cleared his throat. He opened his Bible. He had marked, that morning, a page in Proverbs. He looked down at the page. He looked up at the congregation. He looked at the front pew. He saw Camilla Pelletier looking back at him with her small bandaged son on her left and her hand on the small boy's shoulder. The look on Camilla Pelletier's face was not the look she had worn for 2 years from that pew. The Reverend Crane looked back down at his Bible. His hand on the page hesitated. He turned the page. He turned a second page. He stopped. He looked up. He said, "Brothers and sisters, I had prepared this morning a sermon from the book of Proverbs on the question of a woman's adornment. I will set it aside. The events of this week in our valley have moved me to preach, instead from the same book, but from a different chapter." He read in a slow voice, "Strength and honor are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in time to come. She openeth her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. She looketh well to the ways of her household, and eateth not the bread of idleness. Her children arise up and call her blessed." He paused. He looked at the back pew. He said, "I have, brothers and sisters, in my pulpit for 2 years, used the word vanity in a way that I will this morning set down. I have used the word indulgence in a way I will set down. I will speak instead this morning on the word strength. I will speak on what strength looks like when it walks into a snowstorm in the middle of the night to bring 3 small boys down off the ridge of Stillwater Crossing. I will speak on what strength looks like when it sits by the bed of a small boy at 104 degrees of fever for the better part of 2 days. I will speak on what strength looks like when it carries a medicine bag for 4 years through this town without complaint and without thanks." The congregation was very quiet. The Reverend Crane preached for 34 minutes. He preached the plainest sermon of his pulpit. He did not name Elsie Whitman by name. He did not need to. He did not name Wade Buchanan by name. He did not need to. He spoke about strength and honor, and the law of kindness and the women who do, in a frontier valley, what no one else will do. When he finished, he closed the Bible. He stood at the pulpit for a long second. Then Wade Buchanan stood up at the back of the church. He did not speak loud. His voice carried, the way it had at Hollings. He said, "Reverend, if you will permit, I would like to speak a word." The Reverend looked at him. He nodded. Wade Buchanan put his hand on the back of the pew. He looked at the congregation. He looked at the front pew. He looked at Camilla Pelletier. He looked last at Elsie Whitman, who sat beside Asa beside him, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on his face. He said, "I am Wade Buchanan. Most of you know my name. Few of you know my voice. I have been on the ridge above this town for 7 years. I have spoken little. I will speak now." He paused. He said, 3 days before Thursday, I walked into Mr. Hollings' store, and I saw a woman of this town treated in a way that I will not see again in my presence in this valley. I said little to that woman in the store. I have not said much to her since. But I will say this morning to you what I have said to myself every night this week. He turned, slow, and he looked at Elsie. He said in the low voice she had heard at Hollings, "Elsie Whitman, there is a woman in this church who walked into a storm on Thursday night for 2 boys that were not hers. There is a woman in this church who sat by the bed of one of those boys for 30 hours and did not eat. There is a woman in this church who has carried her bag through this town for 4 years and never asked one soul to carry it for her. I have carried it for her once. I would carry it for her always if she would have me to carry it." He stopped. The church did not breathe. He said, "I am not a man for many words. I am a man for one, if you will have me, Elsie. I will not ask twice." Elsie Whitman stood up. She did not say anything for 1 long second. She looked at the man in the black coat in front of her. She looked at the small boy beside her in his Sunday best. She looked at the front pew. Camilla Pelletier was crying. She had not, in any kitchen in Stillwater Crossing, ever been seen to cry. Elsa said in a voice that carried as easily as his did, "Wade Buchanan, the bag has been on my shoulder for 4 years. The shoulder is mine. The bag is mine. I will carry them both with or without a man until the day I am laid down beside it." "The church did not breathe," she said, "but there are two shoulders on a yoke, and I will share a yoke with the man who knew, on the morning before he knew anything else about me, that the only thing wrong in Mr. Hollings' store that day was the woman with her boot on my tin." She stopped. She looked at him. She said, "Yes, Wade, I will have you." The church did not speak for a long second. Then Camilla Pelletier stood up in the front pew. She turned. She faced the back of the church. She began, slow, to clap. Her bandaged son stood up beside her and clapped. Her younger son stood up and clapped. Mr. Pelletier stood up and clapped. The rest of the church stood. The rest of the church clapped. The Reverend Crane stood at the pulpit, and he did not stop them. Elsie Buchanan, between the two adults, did not clap. He reached up. He took his father's hand on one side. He took Elsie's hand on the other. He held both. Outside the white-painted Stillwater Crossing church, the snow began, soft and slow, to fall again. They were married on the porch of Elsie Whitman's cabin on the East Road, on a Saturday afternoon in the third week of March, with the first daffodils up against the south wall, and the snow gone from everywhere except the high pass. The Reverend Augustus Crane performed the service. Camilla Pelletier stood as Elsie's matron of honor. Mr. Hollings, who had not gone to a wedding in 9 years, stood as Wade's witness. The two Pelletier boys in matching gray wool jackets stood with Elsie Buchanan in a small row at the corner of the porch, holding a wooden cup of dried lavender between them. The lavender had been laid down by Elsie herself the year before, in the small bed at the side of the cabin. The wedding band on Elsie's finger that morning was the wedding band her grandfather had given her in 1873, the one he had told her to take west, the one he had told her to wear when she found a man worth wearing it for. She had taken the small carved oak box down from the high shelf the night before. She had taken the ring out. She had laid the old wedding band from Daniel Whitman in the box beside her grandfather's band. She had closed the box. She had put the box back on the shelf. She did not need to take the old wedding band off her finger to make the room for the new one. She had taken it off gently and without sorrow the night Wade had walked into her cabin from the Pelletier house and had sat at her kitchen table and had said, "Elsie, I would not ask you to be a second wife in a man's life. I would ask you to be his only wife. But I would also ask you to know that I will not ask you to be less of a first wife than you have been to Daniel Whitman. There is room in my house for the love you have already done. There will be room for the love we will do." She had not cried then. She had cried later, after he had gone home up the ridge. She had cried into the pillow on her bed that had held the wedding band on its small chain around her neck for 4 years. She had cried for Daniel Whitman, who had been a kind man and a good husband for 4 months. She had cried for Wade's first wife, Margaret, whom she had never met and who had borne him Asa. She had cried for her grandfather. She had cried for the long 4 years of the bag on her shoulder. The next morning she had laid the band in the box and she had put on the grandfather's ring, and she had not taken it off again. The wedding was small. The wedding was good. The Reverend Crane spoke the lines from the Book of Common Prayer, and Wade Buchanan said, in his low voice, "I will," and Elsie Whitman said in her steady voice, "I will," and Elsie Buchanan stepped forward with the wooden cup of lavender between his small hands and tipped a careful sprinkle of it onto the porch boards in front of their feet, the way Elsie had told him to the morning before. After the wedding, the small gathering of guests moved into the cabin for cake and coffee. Mr. Hollings had brought the flour for the cake at cost. Camilla Pelletier had baked it herself the day before. The two Pelletier boys had iced it with their own hands. The cake was, by the small, modest standard of a frontier wedding cake, beautiful. Wade and Elsie cut the cake together. They served the boys first. They served the Reverend second. They served the rest of the guests in the order in which the guests had walked into the cabin. Camilla Pelletier brought her piece of cake to the small bench by the front window. She sat. Elsie sat down beside her. The two women who 4 months before had stood across a counter in Hollings General Store with a tin of laudanum on the floor between them ate cake in the warm quiet of a wedding afternoon. After a while, Camilla Pelletier said, "Elsie." Elsie said, "Camilla, I will not, on any morning of any year, forget the day at Hollings. Neither will I. I will spend the rest of my time in this valley trying to be the woman who lifted her boot before he came in the door. You will be that woman. I have seen it already. I will fail. You will not fail every day. I will not ask you to fail no days. I will ask you to lift your boot when the next tin is on the floor." Camilla Pelletier nodded. She put her hand for a brief moment over Elsie's hand on the bench between them. She left it there for a count of 3. She took it back. She drank her coffee. That was the end of the talk between the two of them on the wedding day. There would be more talks in the months and years to come. But the end of that talk was the beginning of a friendship that would, by the spring of 1885, be the closest friendship either woman had in the valley. The guests went home at sundown. The Pelletier boys hugged Elsie Buchanan and walked home with their mother. Mr. Hollings shook Wade's hand and walked home with his hat in his hand. The Reverend Crane shook Wade's hand and shook Elsie's hand and walked home with his Bible under his arm. The three of them, Wade and Elsie and Asa, walked together out the back of the cabin to the small stable where the wagon was waiting with the trunk that held Elsie's books and her dried herbs and the small carved oak box that held the 2 old wedding bands. They loaded the trunk into the wagon. They closed the cabin door behind them. They locked it. Elsie put the key in her pocket. She would come back once a week to use the cabin for her practice in town. The cabin would not be sold. The cabin would be hers, always. But she would not, from that night forward, sleep alone in it. They drove the wagon up the road, north, out of Stillwater Crossing. They drove past the bend. They drove past the smithy. They drove past the schoolhouse and the church. They turned onto the cut that led up the ridge. The light went golden along the pines. The first stars came out over the high pass. Elsie Buchanan, in the back of the wagon, rode with the small carved oak box in his lap. He had asked on the morning of the wedding if he could carry it. Elsie had said yes. The box was light. The box was heavy. It held, between the 2 old wedding bands inside it, the long 4 years of 2 widowhoods that had ended that morning on a porch on the East Road. Wade drove the wagon with one hand. He had his other hand, his right hand, open on the bench between them. Elsie set her hand inside his. He closed his hand around hers. They drove up the ridge. They reached the cabin at the top at the first true dark. The lamp in the window was already lit. Wade had lit it that morning before he rode down to the wedding. He had wanted, when his new wife came up the road for the first time as his wife, for the light to be there waiting for her. She saw the light. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The man beside her, on the wagon, knew what the lamp meant. He had known what the lamp meant since the morning at Hollings. He had known a small lit window in a long winter was a thing you carried for a woman, whether she asked you to or not. He helped her down. He carried the trunk in. He set the small carved oak box on the high shelf of the new house, next to his own small carved walnut box. The 2 boxes sat side by side on the shelf for the rest of their lives. That night, Elsie Buchanan slept in his own small bed in the corner of the cabin. Elsie Whitman, now Elsie Buchanan, slept beside Wade Buchanan in the larger bed against the back wall, with a wool blanket from Hudson's Bay over them, and the snow off the high pass beginning, at last, to give over to spring. In the small hours of the morning, the boy in the corner bed sat up. He had had a dream. He did not call out. He did not need to. He looked across the dark room. He saw the shape of his father in the larger bed. He saw, beside his father, the shape of the woman who had walked up the ridge in the storm for him. He lay back down. He whispered, very small, into his own pillow, The word he had not yet said aloud to her in any room of any house. He whispered, "Mama." He went back to sleep. That is the story of how the widow Elsie Whitman became Elsie Buchanan in the spring of 1883, in the valley of Stillwater Crossing, in the high country of Wyoming. It is also the story of how a tin of laudanum rolled across the floor of a general store, set in motion a chain of small kindnesses that ended in a marriage, a friendship between two women who had not been kind to each other, and the long opening of a small silent boy to the word he had been holding inside him since his own mother had died. I will tell you only one last thing. The lamp in the cabin window above Stillwater Crossing burned every winter night for the rest of Elsie Buchanan's life. She did not need it to. She knew the road. She knew the cut. She knew every switchback by heart by the second winter. She kept the lamp lit because there was always, in any frontier valley, the chance that another woman was walking up another ridge in another storm with another bag on her own shoulder, looking for a small lit window to walk toward. That is the end of the story.